Hello again. Hope you're doing well. I'm Hardleg Joe, if you didn't know, and today I'm going to be talking about labor unions, also known as trade unions or just unions for short. I've been getting a lot of questions about them lately, and I've come to realize that a lot of people don't really know much about unions. Which, if you're an American, is completely understandable. Going to public school in a conservative state, I didn't really learn much of anything about unions. My history class covered them very briefly, but they were largely framed as organizations that used to be important, but which no longer have a place in modern society. The narrative that I and many others were told was that, back in the 1900s, most workplaces were very dangerous. You'd work 12-hour shifts 6 days a week for little money and no benefits. And if you lost a few fingers in the process, well, the company would just fire you, since there are plenty of starving people without missing fingers to take your place. Labor unions helped change that. They fought the greedy corporations and helped usher in reforms that we take for granted today. Basic things like safety regulations, overtime pay, sick days, a 40-hour work week, and workers' compensation for people who get injured only became standard because unions fought long and hard for them. Now, I think we can all agree that those are good things. But now that we have them, the time for unions is over, right? I mean, that's what I was told. Unions have served their purpose, and now that working conditions are better, we don't really need them anymore. Which is kind of like saying, houses are less flammable than they used to be. Why don't we just get rid of the firefighters, right? Like, who are they really helping these days? It's absurd, to be frank. Greed is like fire. It is not a problem that can be solved permanently. It is a constant threat that needs to be stamped out whenever it arises. Getting rid of the only organizations that can do that will only allow the problem to grow out of control. As long as houses can catch fire, we will always need firefighters. And as long as business owners can make an extra buck by exploiting their workers, we will always need labor unions to protect those workers. Without them, companies will lower pay, will remove benefits, and people will suffer because of it. The world will be made a worse place. And that's not me being cynical or overly pessimistic. It is demonstrably true. The profits of big businesses are reaching record highs right now. Our country has never been more productive or more profitable. And yet our wages and benefits have largely stayed the same, or even gotten worse. Which means business owners across the board are making us do more work for less money. We are getting a smaller and smaller slice of the pie, while those at the top take more and more. Without unions to fight for workers, their conditions have not only stagnated in this country, they have regressed. Pay has gotten so bad that, once again, people are having to work more than 40 hours just to afford basic necessities. Which is something you don't see in European countries that have strong unions. All of this begs the question, if unions are so useful, why has their membership fallen? Well, part of the reason is political. Since the 1950s, corporations have done everything in their power to weaken unions. They have lobbied politicians, mostly conservative ones, to remove or weaken the legal protections that unions have, strengthening their own authority in the process. The other part of it is good old-fashioned propaganda. The same companies that fund politicians also fund media companies which spread misinformation about unions. And they've done an excellent job of that, seeing as most modern Americans don't seem to understand what a union is or what it actually does. That's why I wanted to make this video, to hopefully clear things up and explain exactly what labor unions are and how they work. So, what is a labor union? Well, at their core, they're really quite simple. They are a bunch of employees who have decided to interact with their bosses as a team. They are quite literally a union of laborers working together to make all their jobs better. And labor unions function just like any other democratic organization. Which is to say, while there's usually voting involved, the specific rules and structures can vary from union to union. Like with democratic countries, there's no universal system. They're all a little different. The most basic setup, though, is a kind of direct democracy. This is only really used in the smallest unions, the kinds that cover, like, a single workplace. And while those are pretty rare these days, it's worth holding them up as a simple example. These kinds of unions are managed by the employees themselves, and usually have a pretty loose structure. The union members will agree to have regular meetings, maybe once a month or once a week, where they can discuss potential problems. If a problem seems serious, then the union will vote on what to do about it. And if the majority decides that the issue needs to be brought up with their bosses, then they will elect one member to serve as their representative, a union rep, as it were. The rep's job is to talk with the higher-ups on behalf of the union and let them know exactly what the workers want. This is called collective bargaining. Because it's exactly what it is, just a bunch of employees negotiating as a team. Some people mistakenly think that unions force corporations to do things, or that they take freedom away from business owners, but that's not really true at all. Like, even at their most powerful, unions never had that kind of legal authority. They're just a way for all the workers to pool their resources together and talk to the boss with one voice. If anything, this seems kind of weak in terms of getting things done, but it works for a number of reasons. First and foremost is the fact that union reps do have a few legal protections. If they ask for a meeting with the higher-ups, your bosses must meet with them. They cannot legally refuse to negotiate with a union rep, and they must do so in good faith. If they don't, then it's considered unfair labor practice, and the government can step in. Even if you ignore the legal aspect, though, the higher-ups still have some pretty good reasons to listen to a union rep. I mean, who knows the conditions on the ground better than the employees actually doing the work there? If all of them get together and decide that there's a serious problem, it's probably something worth looking into. Something that could seriously hurt the company if not dealt with properly. Union reps also provide important insight into employee morale. Like, any smart business knows that worker satisfaction is the key to productivity. Make your workers happy, make them want to work there, and they will gladly work harder for you. Make them upset, and they'll do the bare minimum required to keep their job. Upset all of them at once by ignoring their concerns, and it could lead to pretty massive problems. Like a strike. For those of you who don't know, a strike is when all the workers refuse to work. You might think that that would lead to all of them being fired, but that's one of the few protections that unions can offer. Companies aren't allowed to fire or punish employees for taking part in union activities. So if a union decides democratically to go on strike, then it's considered a union activity, and they can't legally fire you for it. Now, that being said, they don't have to pay you during a strike, and they can try to bring in new workers to replace you, which sounds kind of like being fired, but doing the latter is easier said than done. Because you see, striking workers are allowed to form a picket line, which is where they stand outside of their workplace and let everyone know exactly why they are striking. They can't physically stop new workers from going in, but the presence of a picket line tends to have a significant mental effect on people. Most of us in this world are workers. So if there's a conflict between working class people who are being wronged and a handful of rich business owners, most people are going to side with their fellow workers. That's what picket lines do. They appeal to a sense of solidarity. Replacement workers may see them and decide they don't want to betray the cause. Customers may see it and decide they don't want to support a company that screws over its workers. But even for selfish people who don't care about solidarity, picket lines still act as a pretty good deterrent. Like, if you think about it, they're a huge red flag. If you're walking into your new job and the first thing you see is a bunch of angry employees marching outside, that's a sign that the job you signed up for is probably not worth the pay. And if you're a customer, a picket line is a sign that the people who are working are probably temps who don't really know what they're doing. If a company doesn't shut down completely during a strike, its products are usually inferior during that time. Not something you really want to spend money on. But I digress. Let's get back into union structure. So far, I've only talked about the smallest and simplest types of union, because they're the easiest to understand. They are also exceptionally rare these days, because they only really work for locally run businesses that have 100 or so employees all at one single location. Now, there used to be a time when that was fairly common. A sizable chunk of the population used to work in factories or stores that were owned by a single person who was also the boss. You know, they would come in and actually do some work. These days, though, most people are employed by huge national corporations, which are owned by dozens, if not hundreds, of unseen shareholders. These people own the company, but most of them don't work there. Hell, they might not even live in the same country as you, or even know that they own part of your company. So if you work in retail, or customer service, or fast food, you will probably never meet the people you actually work for. Because your true bosses are just shareholders who don't work for a living. The people you think of as your bosses, the managers who tell you what to do, they're in the same boat as you. They are also workers. They don't own the business, they've just been hired to manage it. In cases like this, where you're dealing with a national or even an international company that's owned by hundreds of people spread all across the world, you're going to need a union that is much larger and much more well organized. This is where the big unions come in. Many of the older professions, like teachers, nurses, and warehouse workers, they have huge nationwide unions that have been around for 100 years and represent tens of thousands of workers. These large-scale labor unions have much more complex structures than their smaller counterparts, to the point that some of them are almost like miniature governments. For example, the National Education Association, which is the largest teachers' union in the United States, is managed by a president and a board of directors, who are elected by a huge assembly made up of all the local union reps from across the country. In this way, the representative that your particular workplace chooses acts kind of like a senator in the Union Congress, bringing your local concerns to the national stage. Again, though, that's just one way to do things. As I said before, each union is a little different. They're all democratic at heart, but what positions they have and how they are elected can vary pretty wildly. Which means I can't really describe how these bigger unions work in a broader sense. Fortunately, though, most of the major unions have websites now, and they tend to be very transparent about how they're run. So if you want to find information about a specific organization, you can usually find it with a quick Google search. Now that being said, while the big unions may all be structured differently, one thing they generally have in common is that they tend to offer more than just a representative. Many of them retain lawyers who will represent workers in legal battles. Some will hire negotiators specifically to assist the union reps when dealing with larger organizations. They also tend to have an emergency fund or a strike fund, which is a big pool of money that workers can live off of when they aren't able to work for one reason or another. Most big unions also have accountants and secretaries to keep track of everything, spokespeople to help recruit new members, and some even employ lobbyists of their own to counteract the corporate ones and push for workers' rights on a governmental level. In order to afford all this, unions require money, which they collect in the form of union dues. If you think of the unions as being like little governments, then their dues are essentially taxes. Everyone pays a small percentage of whatever they earn, and that money is used to fund the resources that help everyone. Now, anti-union propaganda will often make a big deal about how the unions take your money, but union dues are usually only 1 or 2% of your total paycheck. And that cost is offset by the fact that union workers, on average, get paid 11% more than non-union workers doing the exact same job. So you're giving up 1% in order to earn 11% more, along with all the other benefits and protections that unions offer, which really can't be understated. Like, whether it's getting paid vacation time, or protecting you from sexual harassment, or making sure your boss can't fire you for posting memes on social media, unions have your back. Because in many ways, unions are you. It's you and your coworkers democratically deciding how you want to run the workplace. So if something dumb or dangerous or wasteful or immoral is happening at your job, you can actually do something about it. Unions allow you to make a positive change to your workplace in a way that you never could as an individual. And I know at this point I probably just sound like I'm gushing about unions, but honestly, they really just are that good. Like, I went into this video intending to provide a really balanced view that looked hard at the pros and cons of unions. But in doing my research, I couldn't really find any cons. There's only 2 legitimate downsides to unions that I've seen, and neither one really holds a lot of weight. The first downside is that big unions can become corrupted. It's not too difficult to find news stories about union leaders who have embezzled funds or used underhanded tactics to achieve their goals. One major union in particular, the Teamsters, even has a long history of being connected with the mafia. It's not anymore, but a lot of anti-union propaganda really tries to focus on the fact that it was corrupt at one point. The thing is, though, this downside isn't unique to unions. Any large organization is prone to corruption. Many modern companies are very corrupt. Every government in the world deals with some corruption, as do school districts, police precincts, sporting organizations, and even charities. And the strange thing is, right, few people will argue that you should never give to charity. Most recognize that even if some of them are corrupt, they aren't all bad all the time. But when it comes to unions, some people will use the corruption of a few as an excuse to disregard all of them. Like, I feel almost silly having to say this out loud, but just because something can be corrupted doesn't mean it's inherently bad. Especially when the vast majority work as intended and their benefits far outweigh the risks. The fact that a few unions have been corrupted in 100+ years is no reason to forswear all unions forever. We just have to be vigilant about corruption in the same way that we are with every organization. Now, the other big downside to unions is that in many ways, they don't go far enough. Like, this may seem strange to some of you, but I personally have very little interest in unions. simply because they seem like a band-aid being applied to a gaping wound. Allow me to explain. If you've seen my previous videos on economic democracy, you know that I like to compare private businesses to monarchies, since they both have similar power structures. Like, businesses are not only authoritarian in the way they're ran, but they're also owned by a relatively small number of wealthy elites, not unlike the nobility of medieval Europe. Both nobles and shareholders are people who rake in money simply by owning property, which, at this point, was likely inherited from their parents and will likely be passed down to their children. So if you think of businesses as being like monarchies, then having a union is kind of like making a constitutional monarchy. If you don't remember those from history class, that's where a bunch of the citizenry gets together and forces some kind of representation on their rulers, usually by enacting a constitution or making a parliament or a congress of some kind. The king still gets to be the king, there are still nobles, but they have some ground rules to abide by, and the citizens can try to bargain with him through a democratic institution. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's certainly better than an absolute monarchy where the king can just do whatever he wants, but when you look back through history, constitutional monarchies were mostly just stepping stones towards democracy. They are compromise systems, which usually didn't stand the test of time. Unions feel the same way. They are a compromise, a weak first step towards true economic democracy. Now, historically, most countries had a revolution of some kind, where the citizens removed the nobility from power and made more democratic nations. I believe that the same thing will eventually happen on an economic level. Someday, most people will realize that business owners are just leeches who offer nothing of value, and they will remove them from power so that businesses can be run by the people. Because of this, unionizing almost feels like a waste of time. Like, why make a whole other organization just to bargain with business owners when the workers should just remove owners from the equation and control the businesses themselves? Like, that would streamline everything, give workplaces all the benefits of having a union and more, while also cutting down on bureaucracy and reducing corruption. Now, of course, while that's the best solution in my opinion, that's also a pretty big step that would require a lot of people on board. And at the moment, most Americans don't really seem to understand what economic democracy is, much less how to achieve it. So while unions may just be a band-aid solution, they are better than nothing, and they are at least a step in the right direction. Until we're ready as a society to completely revolutionize the economy, unions are the next best thing. So if you get a chance to support a union or join a union, I would highly recommend it. And if your workplace doesn't yet have a union, well, starting one is actually pretty simple. You see, way back in 1935, Congress set up an agency called the National Labor Relations Board. Its job is basically to help workers start and maintain unions. If you can get 30% of the people at your workplace to sign a petition saying they want to unionize, then you can send it to the NLRB and they will set up an official vote for you and your coworkers. If more than 50% of the employees vote yes to unionize, then bam, got yourself a legally recognized union. It's that simple, really. From there, you can pick your representatives, and if your bosses refuse to negotiate with them or they try to punish you for being in a union, then you can report them to the NLRB, because they have the legal authority to investigate unfair labor practices and punish those who violate the law. Now, if you just want a small little union for your local workplace, you can do this all on your own. All you need to do is print up a petition, get the people at your workplace to sign it, and then contact the National Labor Relations Board when you're ready. If you'd like to be part of a bigger organization, well, that's just as simple, perhaps even simpler, because there's a lot of people out there who are willing to help you. The biggest and broadest organization, and also the one with the most complicated name, is the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is usually just called the AFL-CIO. If unions are like little governments, then you can think of this organization as like the United Nations of Unions. It's a union of other unions which has very little power over the individual members. It has the ability to expel people for corruption. It's kind of concerned with oversight. But other than that, it mostly just exists to promote communication between unions and help workers start or join unions. Their website has many excellent resources on it, including information on how to contact a union organizer, which is someone who will help you through the process of starting a new union or joining one of the major ones. Alternatively, if you want something a little more local, a little more specific, most of the big unions have their own websites with their own union organizers who are willing to assist you. If you work in retail or with food, then United Food and Commercial Workers will probably help you start a local branch. If you're a nurse, a healthcare worker, or a janitor, then you can try Service Employees International Union. Truck drivers and warehouse workers may want to check out the Teamsters, who fixed their corruption problems a while ago and are still going strong. There's also United Auto Workers, the American Federation of Teachers, Communications Workers of America, and for construction workers, the Laborers International Union of North America. And that's just some of the biggest ones. No matter what you do, there is probably already a union out there that will suit your needs. There's probably more than one. Just do a little Google searching or check Wikipedia, honestly, and you should be able to find what you need. This is all very publicly available information. It's just a matter of knowing that it's out there and taking that first step to reach out and find it. And on that note, I think I'll leave you to it. Hopefully, if you had any questions about what unions are or how to start/join them, this video helped you. Or at the very least, put you on the right track so that you know how to research it on your own. And if not, well, feel free to comment down below and I'll do my best to answer when I get a chance. Regardless, thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Please take a moment to share this video around if you know anyone who would find it useful. And if you like videos like this, consider subscribing to get more of them. Or check out some of my previous videos. I've got a whole series on economic democracy if you were curious about that. I've also got some dealing with misinformation, as well as just some political basics for those who are just kind of getting interested in these kinds of topics. Whatever you do, it's been a pleasure as always to help, and until next time, stay safe out there.